Howdy folks, today we're looking at Battlefield Action number 86 from 1984 in Charlton Comics. This is one of the last comic books Charlton ever published. The final issue of Battlefield Action was 89, just 3 issues later. From the evidence of this comic, the writing was on the wall. This is all reprints, and old ones at that. Now, NotEvenComics.org has full credits for these stories. The first tale, called simply The Hunter, and dated in 1970, is barely an anecdote about an episode dodging a sniper on the ridges of North Korea. A very plain story told in a straightforward manner, a notable yarn of basic wartime survival, intentionally banal in context. The cover feature, the Steel Halo from 1958, is a tribute to that most humble staple of battlefield kit, the helmet. We see a grunt through basic training in World War II, struggling with keeping his helmet on at every step. Eventually he finds himself in Europe, and wouldn't you guess, that same helmet that was always falling off his head during basic manages to save his life. We know who drew that, a man named Sid Czech, who shows off some interesting layouts. The real attraction here, however, is a story from 1968, written by Willie Franz and drawn by none other than the great Sam Glanzman. Although Here Lies John Williams is far from the best war story to Glanzman's name, it's head and shoulders above the other two stories here, featuring as it does Glanzman's expressive storytelling. It's a bit of a macabre turn, with the titular Williams overcome by superstition of his premature death during an important intelligence raid on New Guinea. Now, of course, it must also be noted, this comic features every conceivable kind of racial slur against Asian people used in a wartime context. So caveat emptor, this was a kid's comic from another world entirely. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Superman, the Man of Steel Annual number 4 from 1995 in DC Comics. After 93's disappointing Bloodlines effectively killed the annual crossover for both Marvel and DC, the latter retrenched to unifying themes for subsequent years. 94's annuals were all Elseworlds, for instance. They followed that with 95's Year One focus. 8 years after Miller and Mazzucchelli's original Batman story, the company had effectively turned the label into a genre all its own. I've always been a fiend for annuals, perhaps because I came up in this period. DC especially put a great deal of effort into annuals as the 90s wore on, which is why you can look back and find a book like today's Superman annual, a giant-sized story drawn by the legendary and sorely lamented John Paul Leon. Most of Leon's work up to this point had been for the company's Milestone imprint, where he drew much of the first year of Static, as well as a year and a half of Shadow Cabinet. He arrives in Metropolis fully formed, already every bit the inimitable stylist. He was just so good with spotted blacks, one of the very best to ever do it, confidently abetted here by old hand Dennis Janke. There simply isn't a single line out of place, not a single boring panel in the whole dang book. This was only 3 years into his career. As for the story, well, it's Superman in his first year of business, with a focus on his first meetings with the founders of the Justice League of America. Louise Simonson is writing and effectively telling a story by skipping between passages of John Byrne's initial Man of Steel limited series, Superman's actual Year One from the period. Now, if you're not big on the details of post-crisis Superman, don't let that scare you away. The story has everything you need. It's essentially a series of vignettes, with Superman facing different threats with each member of the early JLA. He helps Green Lantern prevent a falling satellite from leaving a crater in Coast City, lends a hand with the Flash against the Weather Wizard, even helps Aquaman escape from a wrathful Poseidon. When push comes to shove, however, he's just not as interested in hanging around other superheroes as other superheroes are in hanging around him. When he turns them down, he doesn't explicitly say he'd rather spend his spare minutes flirting with Lois Lane at the Daily Planet, but the story does show us that. From the beginning of their acquaintance, she's the most important person in his life. And it's hard not to see why. Lois has rarely looked better than here, drawn by John Paul Leon. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Amazing Spider-Man number 42 from 1966 in Marvel. Yes, not a hoax, not a dream, not a facsimile edition or a masterwork, but my real and actual copy of Spider-Man 42 from the very zenith of the Silver Age of comics. This comic is for me an artifact of a very special time, the early 90s, perhaps the last moment in history when you could still find a copy of such an important issue for a song, so long as it was beat to hell. My very small collection of 60s Marvel is composed of positively pulverized specimens such as this, and I doubt today you could find even the burnt ashes of this very important comic on sale for the $2 I paid. This is without a doubt one of the most important issues of Spider-Man ever published, for reasons that we shall get to. In the first place, it's being drawn by jazzy John Romita, still just 4 issues into what would become one of the legendary runs in comics history. He was drawing a great deal like Steve Ditko here, something he has spoken about in interviews, and you can still see the various stylistic ticks he picked up from the series' previous co-creator. Check out the emphasis on hand gestures, and the chunky ink lines forming the folds on men's clothing. There's also the small amount of the Ditko struggle throughout his career to draw truly attractive people, whereas Romita's natural instincts tend towards the kind of soft-focused glamour he perfected in his many years drawing romance strips for DC. It changed the strip fundamentally when Romita's instincts in the matter won out, and that sustained attention to the contours of feminine beauty became a staple of the series in every subsequent incarnation. Spider-Man frankly gets on my nerves sometimes, but I sure do love the women he hangs out with. All of which is to say, in addition to a fake-out involving a bogus bank robbery and a brawl with John Jameson after the latter gets hopped up on moon spores, this comic features the very first on-panel appearance of Ms. Mary Jane Watson. After a literal year and a half teasing the character without actually showing anything, her first on-panel appearance unfolds like a punchline. Perfectly timed, the blockbuster reveal of a drop-dead gorgeous redhead forever changed the character's trajectory. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Glass Corridor, an Aliens one-shot from 1998 in Dark Horse Comics. Many notable creators passed through Dark Horse in the 90s for the purpose of working on the venerable Alien and Predator franchises. Our specimen today is just one example of that tendency, presenting a full issue-length story of the infamous interstellar beast as illustrated by the inimitable talent of the great David Lloyd. Yes, that David Lloyd, co-creator of V for Vendetta, drawing and writing a paranoid and claustrophobic story of, what else, being trapped in a confined space with the most dangerous animal in the universe. Our hero is Frank, a hired killer who lost his nerve and had to ship out in the stowage of a planetary freighter. Of course, it shouldn't surprise you to hear someone was smuggling something they very much shouldn't have been, and once the cryogenic containment on that seal is broken, everyone on the ship is dead meat. The crew die first, and all that's left between the monster and innocent stowaways is the murderer. Lloyd draws a cracking good alien, a creature of pure movement, sticky ink lines blurred to signify a creature never still long enough to be seen, skulking like a dart through the dark shadows of the galactic Gothic. It's only one story, but man, our venerable xenomorph has rarely looked this good. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Batman 3 Jokers #1 from DC Comics in 2020. It's been a few years and the hype has finally died down. What better time to look back at one of the most controversial series in recent memory? Now, I've enjoyed some Jeff Johns books. He's got a knack for structure as well as expanding familiar concepts in novel ways. Those aren't small things, and together they've papered deficiencies in many readable stories. Now, sometimes I haven't cared for those novel directions, and definitely sometimes I don't like his characterization. But more than anything, what I don't enjoy about Johns has been his instinct towards adding more cruelty and arbitrary violence to his stories than strictly necessary. Now, of course, he's not the first person to ever do this, which is what this story is about. It's built largely as a direct response to perhaps the most cruel and arbitrary Batman story of all, The Killing Joke. Now, Johns didn't write that story, and I've always considered the fact that its original writer has more or less disowned it to be a rather telling acknowledgement that the story represented a particular point of terminus, an endpoint to the genre's ability to deal with the consequences of violence. That is the question up for debate in 3 Jokers. Just how far can these stories go into that kind of Grand Guignol before they collapse of their own weight? Tellingly, there's nothing in these pages that seems specifically out of bounds or over the top in context. The worst violence here occurs off-panel and in flashback. The Joker killed Jason Todd a long time ago. Even if the erstwhile Robin got better, the moment he was almost beaten to death has lingered just as acutely as Barbara Gordon being paralyzed. Those stories are both 35 years old and were produced during one of Batman's most popular periods. So the argument that that kind of violence has no place in the franchise is frankly untenable, much as it goes against my preferences. The titular 3 Jokers in this story are dedicated to pain and mayhem as goals in and of themselves. It's even asserted that the Joker isn't really that funny anymore, and that's very true. That's not to say the story didn't make me laugh. After all, bringing back Gaggy, of all people, just to have a shark eat him is perhaps the most Jeff Johns thing Jeff Johns has ever done. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Steel Town Rockers #1 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. This is a unique book in Marvel history, a rare attempt by the company to do something genuinely different. Unfortunately, it didn't catch on. I was paying a lot of attention to their acts at my local 7-Eleven at the time, and they couldn't move this book for love or money. That's a shame, but it's that very memory that pushed me to track the series down not that long ago. Sure enough, this is like nothing Marvel was doing at the time, and frankly, ever. It's a story about kids stuck growing up in a Midwest mill town town after the mill closed, coming together to use their talent to try to make something better for themselves. Now, given what I said about the book not doing well, it's ludicrous to see in hindsight just how siloed the American market was, that a book like this found no purchase even in 1990. In any other medium, you could mention kids coming together to form a band as one of the most basic evergreen stories. But in 1990, comics was already too fractured to support a book aimed squarely at the general audience. This is as accessible as comics get, a story about real people in the real world, perhaps a belated attempt on Marvel's part to find some of the audience for these kinds of stories that had been exposed by what was already the enduring crossover success of Love and Rockets. Alas, Marvel, even as far back as 1990, didn't know how to sell comics to anyone who wasn't already buying Marvel Comics. Writer Elaine Lee is one of the more intriguing figures from this era of comics, genuinely ahead of her time in many ways. This series deserves a lot more attention than it has ever received. So next week we'll look at issue number 2 and spend more time on artist Steve Leialoha's expressive contributions. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Gen 13 Ordinary Heroes number 1 from 1996 in Image Comics. If you weren't around in the mid-90s, it might be difficult to explain just how big a deal Gen 13 actually were. In the midst of one of the worst bear markets the industry had ever seen, it was one of a handful of true success stories, a second-generation blockbuster from Image that hit at just the right moment to capitalize on fatigue with the generally lackluster diminished returns that had set in with many of the company's founding launch titles. Gen 13 succeeded largely because it was significantly different than anything Image had done up to then. A bit of a cheesecake book in a retail climate where bad girls were fast becoming the only dependable sellers, as well as a character-driven series. Much of the book was comprised of the gang hanging around La Jala and getting into hijinks, the kind of familiar comforts largely eschewed by the over-the-top hysterics of books like Wildcats and Youngblood. Problem was, in the fine Image tradition, they couldn't quite get the book out the door monthly. There was more demand for Gen 13 product than there was Gen 13 product, so they brought in as many people as possible to strike while the iron was hot and flesh out these characters to whom readers had already responded. The issue today marks a special occasion indeed. Not only was it Adam Hughes drawing and writing 2 issues of the hottest characters in the industry, it was Hughes' first bad at writing, period. It does betray some of the telltale signs of the novice writer, inasmuch as it takes a great deal of real estate to tell not a lot of story. But, as opposed to many of the early Image auteurs who stumbled in this arena, those slow pages are filled with character work, real conversations, even jokes. There's some cheesecake, yes. Hughes is under no illusions that anyone buying a Gen 13 comic wants to see Fairchild in various states of distress and undress. But for all that, it's simply gorgeous, one of the nicest looking books Image published during their first decade. Sadly, like much else from the company during this period, their early computer colors ran a bit dark, especially on the newsprint Image was using for their newsstand editions. I have the direct sales version of issue 2, and you can see the difference for yourself next week. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at DC Comics Presents 88 from 1985. Smack in the middle of Crisis on Infinite Earths, we find this, a team-up between Superman and the Creeper that fits the classical definition of a red skies crossover. The world is ending in another story, and because of that the skies are red here in an unrelated series. Although ostensibly a team-up between Superman and the Creeper, and a funny one at that since the Creeper clearly gets on Superman's nerves, the real action is a conflict between Clark Kent and Jack Ryder, as broadcasters with quite different philosophies, facing the end of the world as a professional challenge. Frankly, I wasn't expecting this almost 40-year-old Crisis tie-in to have such a contemporary hook, with Kent confronting Ryder over what the former sees as a dereliction of duty on the part of the latter, in providing an outlet for uninformed and unbalanced characters to spew lies on an ostensible news program. Kent thinks Ryder's scaring people for ratings. Ryder more or less agrees, because that's what he's being paid to do. Ryder's Steve Englehart has no easy answers. Ryder makes serious mistakes, which he personally corrects, but it doesn't change his philosophy towards manufactured sensationalism. When I picked this comic to talk about, what jumped out was the formal daring of Keith Giffen, infamous in some circles, perhaps for his influences during this period, but notable for so much more. This is simply a dynamite book, all long establishing shots contrasted with tight close-ups, a dynamic give and take between large and small that often leaves the characters themselves uncomfortable and awkward. Every scene seems like a conscious attempt to draw Superman differently than he's ever been drawn before, shattered and brooding, pulsating with primitivist energy, or just out of the shot entirely. The best parts remind me of some of the truly wild passages from Von Eden's concurrent run on World's Finest. The mid-'80s Superman line had some surprisingly experimental episodes, a startling alternate trajectory largely effaced by the subsequent post-crisis period. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Doctor Strange 57 from 1982 in Marvel Comics. Although on first blush this may appear to be merely another issue from the middle of Roger Stern's long and eventful run on the Sorcerer Supreme, I beseech you, look closer at the credits box and take a look at this art team. The great Terry Austin inking none other than Kevin Nolan in the latter's very first professional art job. Yes, this humble comic is Nolan's first published work as a professional artist, after early pieces appearing in magazines like Amazing Heroes, and this is pretty spectacular work for anyone, let alone anyone's first job. Doctor Strange is typically a talky book, a tendency usually balanced by fantastic set pieces built around unique imagery. This can be explained by recourse to the fact that Doc likes to hear the sound of his own voice, and he needs often to explain what's going on in regards to stories whose physical stakes may not be immediately apparent in the way they are for more grounded characters who deal with the cause and effects of physical reality. This run is notable for its large supporting cast. In his first at-bat ever, Nolan has to balance not just Doc and Wong, but Morgana Blessing, Sarah Wolfe, the aged Genghis, and even Doctor Doom for a page, as well as the very much not mystical menace of a crowd of very normal people drawn to mob the Sanctum Sanctorum for the purpose of becoming Doc's new disciple, a job not exactly listed in the classifieds, which is where the issue's mystery begins, before involving longtime X-Men supporting cast member Amanda Sefton, here using her government name Jermaine Sardos. Considering just how much Nolan would come to be known for his deep-spotted blacks and delicate detail, being paired with Austin right out of the gate seems almost perverse. The latter's dependence on precise hatching and seeming reluctance to use the fat end of the brush can clash with some pencilers. But I also sometimes underestimate his versatility, as this issue demonstrates he could roll with the punches when necessary. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen 97 from 1966 in DC Comics. This issue features the epic saga of the Batman-Superman of Earth X. No, not a crossover with Marvel's fun-to-see alternate universe epic, but another Earth X entirely, a parallel Earth on which Jimmy finds himself thrown after blatantly disregarding Professor Potter's safety warnings regarding his dimension travel machine. Jimmy, being Jimmy, accidentally sets off the machine and finds himself in a world where Perry White works as a famous matador, and Clark Kent is a custodian at the World's Fair, writing sci-fi novels in his spare time. Remarkably, Jimmy develops superpowers during his stay on this strange Earth, and designs a costume for himself by combining elements of Superman and Batman's uniforms. As Steel Man, he battles the Scourge of Earth X, the villainous Luthor, an organization with the acronym League Using Terror, Havoc, and Robbery, which only seems like a joke off a 90s rap skit. On this world, Luthor is actually being run by the Joker, and of course Lucy Lane is as infatuated with her world's new superhero as Lois is with the regular Superman. The author of Jimmy's surreal voyage across the worlds is none other than the great Bill Finger himself. Yes, the co-creator of Batman and the Joker also wrote this odd story, drawn by the ever-reliable Pete Costanza. It's not completely witless, however. Finger has some fun with background details, like Benedict Arnold being the second president, and Mickey Mantle, a famous actor, all of which leads up to the biggest reversal of all, the revelation of the Joker's real identity on this topsy-turvy world. More disturbing by far than anything in Three Jokers. The backup features Sergeant Olson, the toughest man in the Marines, is just bizarre, featuring Jimmy undercover as a Marine drill sergeant trying to root out Russian spies. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at The Great British Bump-Off #1, a new book from Dark Horse Comics. How strange to reflect on the fact that I've been reading and even occasionally writing about John Allison's extended Tackleford universe for well over 2 decades, long enough to remember when it was all about Tessa and Rachel, almost a decade prior to the first appearance of the saga's current de facto protagonist, Shauna Wickle. She's currently a contestant on UK Bakery Tent, a reality show baking contest rocked by the sudden death of a particularly annoying participant. Before you can say Agatha Christie, we're off to the races. The races in this instance being the investigation into the poisoning murder of a thoroughly unlikable gentleman whose demise provokes no shortage of suspects. Thankfully, the talented Ms. Wickle is an experienced investigator of various foul deeds, and so the future of the show is placed in her, at times, rather unbalanced hands. John Allison remains one of the best comedy writers in all of comics, fluent in both puns and batter. Memorable side gags such as an Altamont tribute cake linger in memory. Longtime collaborator Max Sarin manages the neat trick of being reminiscent of Allison's own work, while also adapting layouts and design to fit the more expansive real estate of the printed page. What could in other hands be a static and challenging setting for a cartoonist comes to life with vigor and charm. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Batman 3 Jokers #2 from DC Comics in 2020. Now, while I believe a number of questionable decisions went into the making of this book at every step, from conception to execution, I also want to single out Jason Fabok for his work. I quite like his art, and for that reason found this to be a very readable book despite my larger misgivings. Jeff Johns is clearly going for a mood piece in the mold, as I said, of The Killing Joke. Now, frankly, that book is not top shelf more by any measure. Even if you like it, it's a small subject built around the unquestionable skill of its artist. Whatever value it retains after decades of dilution and plagiarism is due to Brian Bolland's skill and imagination. Some of the less successful writerly effects here are transparent and deliberate attempts to borrow effects of Moore's. Now, The Killing Joke has been recolored over the years, based partly on Bolland's dissatisfaction with John Higgins' original work. Despite Bolland's clear skill, no one should ever have let him recolor that book. The new colors are flat, uninspired, and overly literal, without a jot of the garish wit of Higgins' gorgeous originals. If I were feeling ungenerous, I'd say that was the size of the matter for this story. An inflation of that same misguided impulse towards cod realism, flat, uninspired, and overly literal. But that only tells part of the story. Fabok, as I say, elevates the material. I like the way he draws these characters. They have weight and distinctive presence on the page. His Batman is a violent fireplug, his Batgirl intrepid and driven without losing her appeal. Frankly, I think he draws a great Batgirl. She comes out the best from this. Whether or not it was a creative mistake to restore the use of her legs, the story is built on the example of her strength. It is possible to lift yourself up from unspeakable tragedy, but it requires putting in the work to rebuild your character along the way. That's a real thing, a true message at the heart of this relentlessly overwrought pageant. I like Fabok's Batgirl. I'd read more of her. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Steel Town Rockers #2 from Marvel Comics in 1990. The drama continues with a slight personnel change. Elaine Lee takes over colors this issue in place of Michael Higgins, and the results are interesting to say the least. In the days prior to computer coloring, you didn't often see such a commitment to pastel. Add to that the occasional manual color hold, and the result is different from just about anything else from Marvel at the time. Steve Leialoha always manages to surprise me. As an inker, he can be precise and even technical, but as an artist in his own right, he's loose, expressive. In hindsight, his early work over Carmine Infantino seems to have really stuck and influenced his pencils. The elastic effect is similar to contemporary work from Kyle Baker. As for the story, well, the trials of our young garage band continue apace. They can't decide on a name, they can't find a satisfactory practice space, and they can't find a drummer who can commit to regular practice. In other words, this is the primal story of pretty much every high school band since the dawn of creation. You've got half a dozen musicians with different backgrounds. The guitarist thinks they need to learn some cover songs off top 40, probably necessary if they ever want to make any gigs, sad to say, while the sax player keeps name-dropping Athens bands like the Coolies, admittedly not a band that gets name-dropped much today. The price of rehearsal space turns out to be getting a synth player with a chip on his shoulder. The sheer numbing cavalcade of quotidian obstacles is familiar to anyone who knows anything about starting a band. Somehow, despite it all, the desire to make music as an ensemble outweighs the inconveniences of making music as an ensemble. Meanwhile, Johnny's dad almost sets himself on fire falling asleep in front of the TV. He's not taking the loss of his job at the mill well at all. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Gen 13 Ordinary Heroes #2 from 1996 in Image Comics. This is the concluding chapter of Adam Hughes' writing debut, a story about a mysterious menace with surprising ties to the Gen 13 team. There are two villains here. In the first place, the actual menace itself, a vaguely Lovecraftian blob beast, a shuggoth in the common parlance, all tentacles and appetite, consuming everything in its path. But the second villain, and a far more insidious foe, is the smokescreen of secrecy from the spy agencies that continually bedevil Gen 13. That's one of the series' consistent themes in every incarnation. Lynch's I.O. knows more about whatever is happening than they let on, invariably to the detriment of anyone else who happens to be involved. In this instance, the bulk of the story is devoted to tracking down the truth of the matter after the team is confronted by and handily bested by the beast on first contact. The team's refusal to play by the same rulebook as the intelligence community that created and tries to control them remains integral to the concept. Gen 13 were rebels against the military-industrial complex, willing at every turn to fight the same shadowy governmental forces that unambiguously mean them harm. So too here, as the team's eventual victory relies on seeing past the spook show and towards the real needs of the people at the heart of the problem. Hughes always puts in the work as a writer whenever he wears that hat. This is more than just an average fill-in. He understands the characters and what makes their world tick in a way that sticks out. No one would have complained had he showed up for 2 issues of fluff. Perhaps some readers would have preferred hijinks at the Bikini Factory. But this isn't fluff. This is actually a bit of a downer as far as Gen 13 stories go. Through it all, of course, Hughes manages to stun with every turn of the page. Even passages of text-heavy exposition are delivered with more imagination and aplomb than you have any right to expect. If you had any doubt that Hughes was already an artist, really less than a decade into his career, there's a brief letter in the back from none other than Charles Vess to prove the point. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Black Canary #1 from DC Comics in 2015. Now, you might be surprised by just how few solo comics Black Canary has actually headlined over the years. A few in the 90s, a series in the aughts, and this book here. All her previous solo stories, even the Alex Toth numbers from Adventure Comics, were backup features. With this in mind, it's a good rule of thumb to check out any Black Canary comics you see. They don't put them out very often, and usually only when they have a good reason. Flashback to 2015, a genuinely conflicted period in DC's history, during which the company was still in the process of crawling out of the rubble of the New 52, but also showing signs of life in terms of fitfully launching new and productive relaunches of seminal characters. This was the period that gave us Batgirl and Burnside, after all, as well as Dick Grayson, Agent of Spiral, to name just 2 influential runs. But I think Black Canary here is probably the best book from this era, or at least my favorite, for one big reason. This was the first place I saw the work of Annie Wu, and in fairness, when this comic first dropped, I didn't care for it. I think more to the point, I didn't get it, because it was so different, so far from where the character had been and where the rest of the line was. And yet, looking back, it's impossible to see that Wu wasn't years ahead of the industry in terms of what a comic should look like. Bold, brash, confident, while on a completely different vibe, Wu nevertheless earned her place alongside notable Black Canary artists like Toth and Trevor Von Eaton, a rank of true artists, standing head and shoulders above the very best talents of their respective eras. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Web of Spider-Man 16 from 1986 in Marvel Comics. For most of its life, the third most important Spider-Man book was often overlooked and consigned to fill-ins for much of its early run. This issue of the book promises something different. The first issue in Web's daring new adventures in mystery and suspense, as the cover promises. Although it might seem like merely useless cover hype, the fact is that this issue did represent a significant change, with the addition of a new artist joining writer David Michelini, a fellow you may have heard of named Mark Silvestri. Fresh off his 2 formative years drawing King Conan. And, as if that weren't enough, Silvestri is joined here on inks by Kyle Baker. Now, Silvestri learned quite a bit from drawing Conan, so by the time he arrives for his brief half-year stint on Spider-Man, he's already a good ways towards becoming the consummate stylist of his epical run on Uncanny X-Men. As you might expect, Baker's inks pull out Silvestri's tendency towards expressive faces and caricature. Frankly, the real villain here is the poor reproduction of art emblematic of the era. All the hallmarks of Silvestri's mature style are already present. The action reads flawlessly, the body language conveys a great deal of story, and it definitely looks like he's spent more time drawing the beautiful women than anything else in the book. It's not hard to see why he got the nod for X-Men when he did. He was already firing on all cylinders in '86, and the next 5 or 6 years only saw further development. Now, sadly, the issue after this was inked by Vince Colletta, who in fairness did share one trait with Silvestri, a tendency to focus on drawings of pretty women to the expense of every other element of the story. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Usagi Yojimbo Where When #1, a new crossover series from IDW. Our venerable turtles have a long history with Stan Sakai's long-running Samurai Rabbit. Usagi has appeared alongside the turtles many times on television and in the comics, all the way back to 1989. The latest team-up series is written and drawn by Sakai, which affords the opportunity not just to see Sakai draw the turtles for an extended adventure, but also ensures the story fits snugly into Usagi's own intricate timeline. If, like me, you're really out of touch with the Turtles' current comics continuity, which appears both Byzantine and lore and steeped in unfamiliar characters, you should be relieved to hear this story picks up with the most classic and identifiable version of the characters, our four turtle brothers fighting low-rent robots in the warehouse district. The villain for the piece is Dr. Werwen, a robot from the future building a time machine in the present to conquer the past. He manages to escape into the past, only to be pursued by the Turtles. Would you believe they happen to pop up right next to Usagi during a hunting expedition by the latter, searching for dangerous Kappa rampaging across the countryside? You couldn't have a better setup for a fight next issue, with Usagi and his companions facing the time-lost Turtles, who, in all fairness, are pretty much dangerous Kappa, from a certain point of view. Certainly, the following issues will see the heroes teaming up to defeat Dr. Werwen, but the circumstances of the plot bringing the main players together are less important than the fact of Stan Sakai drawing the Turtles. He draws the Turtles very well, and it's simply a joy to see an artist of his caliber playing around with these famous characters. Frankly, a delight from beginning to end. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Worlds Unknown number 6 from Marvel Comics in 1973. This issue adapts one of the most famous sci-fi stories of all time, Killdozer by Theodore Sturgeon. Originally published in 1944 in the pages of the legendary Astounding Stories, Sturgeon's saga of construction equipment possessed by a demon from Earth's prehistory was later adapted into a 1974 TV movie. Now, the cover for this issue sadly exaggerates the interior. In the first place, the Killdozer doesn't talk, doesn't have sinister eyes, and there's not a single woman in this story, sadly not even one with a low-cut top. No one fires a gun at the Killdozer, but the Killdozer does indeed kill a lot of people, almost everyone in the construction crew whose ill-fated demolition of an ancient temple accidentally frees the evil spirit from his eternal prison. There's a brief prologue where we see the origins of the Killdozer entity in the form of an ancient war between machines and pre-human civilization that created those machines. This is an impressive sequence, although the sight of a robot apocalypse and a doomsday weapon boiling the seas of the earth is perhaps the highlight of a story that features half a dozen dudes on an island being slowly picked off one by one by an evil bulldozer. The combination of Dick Ayers and Ernie Chan makes for a dynamic story. Chan's heavy atmospheric inks bring shadows to life, and I've come into a new appreciation of later Ayers as a competent journeyman who knew how to lean into expressive inkers. This issue reads quite well, even as much of the action consists of unattractive men yelling racist and insults at each other. Sadly, this was the last issue of the title to feature adaptations of classic stories. The last two issues adapted a film, The Golden Voyages of Sinbad, and then Worlds Unknown was canceled. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Batman 3 Jokers number 3 from DC Comics in 2020. Well, that was certainly a story. Was it a good story? Although there were parts I liked, I don't think it adds up to as much as it seems to want. Any story that places undue weight on the relationship between Batman and the Joker has to be greeted with some skepticism, given that the relationship never strikes me as significant as some creators believe. If you believe that Batman versus the Joker is a primal rivalry that speaks to an elemental schism in humanity's contemporary psyche, well, sure. You can see how the battle of the one truly sane man against the avatar of instability is an emblematic conflict. But that's a big if. Now, if, on the other hand, you tend to roll your eyes at Batman stories that take as a given that the characters have some kind of thematic significance beyond the page, well, it's difficult to see how this does anything but move the pieces on the board. The Joker works best as a mystery. Even as the Killing Joke was accepted into continuity, Moore's feint towards the Joker's origin was very gingerly left aside. If the character has any weight at all, the modern tendency towards explication can only lessen that impact. What 3 Jokers appears to offer more than anything is the solution to a puzzle that didn't need to be solved. Did you really need to explain the Joker's different behavior at different points in his long career? The character changes, often unpredictably. What's interesting is that much of the story is actually focused on 2 characters who have changed considerably, Barbara Gordon and Jason Todd. Those are my favorite parts, actually, even down to Jason's doomed crush on Batgirl. Those scenes actually gave us something interesting. 2 scarred people living with the consequences of having chosen violence as a way of life. The revelation that Batman knew the Joker's identity all along seems superfluous. No one is ever going to, or should ever, pull the thread of the Joker's lost wife and child. The story even says, explicitly, the Joker having a real name in history defeats the purpose of the character. Likewise, having so many ersatz Jokers complicates what is, at best, a very clean dynamic. Maybe it's best, then, to put this up merely as a kind of shaggy dog narrative. Cool story, bro. I'm happy for you. Or sorry that happened. Either one. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Steel Town Rockers number 3 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. The saga of our burgeoning garage band continues with an issue dedicated to showing the events of one single night in the life of our ensemble cast. Here we see the stakes for every character laid out after leaving that night's band practice. Mike and Ed run afoul of a gang of tough guys, and Ed gets beamed with a pipe. Johnny comes home to find his dad 3 sheets to the wind and smashing up the living room. Jace and Terry borrow Jace's parents' Volvo and go out to the clubs, and Sid's mother has to deal with making ends meet with an absent husband. In almost every case, the story is the same. When the plant dries up and blows away, there's no work and no money. The gap between haves and have-nots widens to a chasm as the working middle class slowly disappears. Talent is the only conceivable ticket out, but that ambition also puts a target on your back. You think you're better than me is the undercurrent to so many of these interactions. Ambition can land you in the ER getting stitches for your head, or worse, on your friend's doorstep at 3:30 a.m. because you knocked out your old man for hitting your mom when he was drunk. There's a great deal that remains depressingly contemporary. The economic woes pegged here to the post-industrial Rust Belt eventually became standard for much of the country, and the idea of selling out long ago receded from legibility in favor of aspiring merely to be able to pay one's bills. Lee and Lealoha's story unfolds with naturalistic grace. We see only isolated moments, pointed interactions, and rare quiet interludes. Every character is a product of their environment, and through these characters we see their environment reflected. Desperate, yes, at times even violent, traumatized and defensive, but still clinging to the hope of something better. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Rune number 1 from Malibu Comics in 1993. Enter the Ultraverse. 3 decades ago this summer, Malibu launched a completely new superhero universe to compete with the likes of Image for the hearts and wallets of comic book buyers. Now, I actually quite liked the Ultraverse. The line had some good books and memorable characters, but in its years of existence, the Ultraverse only produced one truly great comic, and that was Rune by Barry Windsor Smith. Windsor Smith had a busy early 90s. Not only was he one of the founding fathers of Valiant alongside Jim Shooter, but after that place started to fall apart, he joined a number of other Bronze Age vets, among the founders of Malibu's subsequent superhero startup, for which this was his contribution. Rune is a lavender vampire from outer space, at least 10,000 years old, who likes to eat people and absorb their precious life energy. He's also dying, albeit very slowly, after trying to eat an atomic bomb many years ago. Rune is a violent and fast-paced book, a story about an avatar of death chasing down powerful psychic twins in the desperate hope that their power can prevent his own demise. If you're a fan of Windsor Smith, all his themes are right here, front and center. Yes, we're back at the intersection of gruesome body horror and shadowy government machinations, with the covert agency Aladdin taking custody of the monster's body after Rune is knocked out of the county by one of the aforementioned psychic twins. Sadly, Windsor Smith's run is brief, and for many reasons we'll probably never see it reprinted, but his work on the character remains a visceral and unforgettable highlight of a very crowded time in comics history. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the Doom Patrol Suicide Squad Special number 1 from 1988 in DC Comics. In hindsight, this comic can't but seem a bit of an oddball for a few reasons. From the vantage point of the present, these two venerable franchises don't appear to have that much in common. John Ostrander's successful reboot of DC's Task Force X was a series about the late Cold War era, an espionage-flavored adventure book steeped in both politics and paranoia. By 1988, it had already proven itself to be one of the company's most notable books, coming out of the period of mid-80s refurbishment typified by the first Crisis on Infinite Earths. In contrast, the late 80s run on Doom Patrol was a slightly less notable achievement. Writer Paul Kupperberg's inarguable affection for the book and characters was unable to overcome what was in practice a fairly pedestrian revamp. That book lost its marquee artist early on, with Steve Lytle lasting not half a year before being replaced by up-and-coming dynamo Eric Larson. Kupperberg and Larson's Doom Patrol didn't set the world on fire, even if it makes for an interesting curio in light of what followed. Both Eric Larson's later star turn at Marvel and Grant Morrison's subsequent rehabilitation of Doom Patrol into one of the company's most cutting-edge books. This double-sized special is an odd artifact of the brief period when Ostrander and Kupperberg's versions of these characters could meet in the middle, tonally, without losing a step. Admittedly, this reads more like a Suicide Squad plot stretched to double size than a Doom Patrol story. The story begins when Hawk, one half of Hawk and Dove, is captured by the Sandinistas during an arms smuggling mission. Why was Hawk smuggling arms in Nicaragua? It was the 80s, of course. Now, the president isn't too too happy about that, so he orders Amanda Waller to send her Suicide Squad to play cleanup. Waller doesn't like it because it's too public and too political, but she doesn't know the half of it. Not only is Russia sending a complement of Rocket Reds to take care of the situation, but through back channels they've also managed to involve Valentina Vostok, the 80s negative woman, and through her the rest of the Doom Patrol on an ostensible mission to save Hawk before the squad can reach him. The real winner here is Larson, still very young and clearly not completely in his wheelhouse to be illustrating so much political intrigue. But that's how you learn to draw a comic, by getting thrown in the deep end of the pool and outside of your comfort zone as an artist. Larson shows a remarkable learning curve during this period. It was only a matter of time after this before he was on to Marvel and the runs on the Punisher and Spider-Man that would make his name. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Cable 97 from 2001 on Marvel Comics. The turn of the century was a strange time for Marvel. They entered the 2000s in dire need of a reset, having spent the late 90s chasing gradually diminishing returns, systematically alienating creators and fans alike with subpar, formulaic output across the line. The resulting shakeup by new management was stark and wide-ranging, with every book eventually impacted by the reforms of the new Marvel period. Not every change was salutary, true, but nor was every successful revamp fully recognized. Case in point, this era of Cable. Few characters were more emblematic of the 90s mode at Marvel than Cable. He entered the new century as exhausted creatively as a character could be, in dire need of refurbishment. Writer David Tishman took the character back to basics. As radically different as these comics are from anything Cable had ever been, Tishman and artist Igor Kordy really only took the character and his premise seriously, arguably for the first time in his history. Cable is a soldier of fortune from the future, sent back to prevent his world from coming to pass. So where would someone like that be spending his time in 2001? In the real world, in places like Peru, fighting people like the Shining Path, a not-at-all fictional group from a not-at-all fictional conflict. The real revelation here is, of course, Croatian artist Igor Kordy. He got a bad name for work that wasn't really his fault. He drew a couple comics in a hurry because his editors needed the hand. Well, those comics weren't near as bad as people screamed, and certainly his work here, where he had plenty of time to do it right, is some of the best and most striking work of its era. Frankly, we did not and still have not appreciated just how good Kordy was and is. His work from this era, the living definition of casting pearls before swine. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Detective Comics 630 from 1991 in DC. This is a highlight from the storied stretch on the book featuring artist Jim Aparo at the absolute height of his powers. Aparo has long been my favorite Batman artist for a number of reasons, and this issue is a great primer on why. His Dark Knight is sleek and athletic, a man of action in a noir-flavored world. Aparo's Batman's also recognizably a human being. No immortal bat god, he's a man who gets bruised and beaten in the course of his duties. A stray kick from a mob enforcer gives him a busted jaw, for instance, the kind of injury that might ruin your day or mine, but is really only business as usual for Batman. Peter Milligan's script is your standard hard-boiled detective story. Batman has to use his brains not just to solve a cipher, but to figure out the real villain in a panoply of ne'er-do-wells. Turns out the real danger is actually the G-Man using Batman to get around unpleasant red tape while tracking down a clutch of hired killers. If there's one problem, it's that the story itself is a little hard to follow. It took me a couple passes to figure out just who was after who, given the twists and turns that occur in a very short amount of time. That might be Milligan's experience writing for 2000 AD. Of course there's more plot than can be readily ascertained at a glance, which I realize is a rich complaint coming from me, considering how often I've lambasted modern comics for being grossly underwritten. Milligan is one of a few Brits who found frequent work on the Bat books in this period. This dense, nasty nugget of yarn is typical of his approach to the character, classical and distinctive at once. The parade of grotesqueries may not have aged quite as well, but is nevertheless a studied throwback to the Chester Gould in Batman's DNA. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Death's Head 2, Volume 2, Number 1 from 1992 in Marvel UK. If you weren't around at the time, you might be slightly confused by the profusion of Death's Heads running around the Marvel Universe at the time. The first Death's Head was a cybernetic bounty hunter who hung around with the likes of Doctor Who and the Transformers, despite also being a Marvel character who fought the Fantastic Four. Cutting a very long story short, when it came time to expand Marvel UK's presence in the American market, they chose not to use Death's Head, opting instead for the far more confusing route of killing the first Death's Head and replacing him with a meaner version, the Minion Cyborg, originally seen in early 1992 in the Death's Head 2 limited series. This was a very busy time for a number of reasons. Sales were up and competition was fierce, and the Marvel UK office tapped a large pool of as-yet untested talent to produce a line of books intended to compete with the first generation of Image, which leads us here to the first issue of Minion's second series, a monthly ongoing debuting at the end of 92 and running 16 issues through what became one of the biggest boom and bust sequences in industry history. Death's Head 2 is very much what you might expect if you asked a group of talented Brits, weaned on 2000 AD, to create a comic book to compete with the likes of Youngblood. Violent, yes, but also unexpectedly funny. What Death's Head 2 shares with its predecessor is a penchant for indefatigably droll one-liners. Writer Dan Abnett definitely has a sense of humor of the kind that was sorely missing from much of the era's signature titles. However, the reason to check this out if you find it is the art, early formative work from the great Liam Sharp. He's still picking up some tricks from Jim Lee here, especially visible once the X-Men show up, and some of the female heroines appear to lead with their derrieres, but already well at home in the arena of massive muscled monsters throwing themselves at one another in spasms of unspeakable violence.